Montana Territory, April 1877. The wind was sharp that morning, cutting low across the scrubland as Zadie Fletcher trudged into the edge of Dawson Hollow, with her baby wrapped close to her chest. Her boots were caked in mud, her hands chapped raw, and her eyes, those green eyes that used to shine like spring, were dull with sleep and sorrow. She had been walking for miles. The baby, Jonah, whimpered softly against her collarbone, his little fingers curled in her hair. She stepped into the main street and the town stopped. Men outside the mercantile paused mid-conversation. A woman sweeping the steps of the church lowered her broom, mouth tight as a stitch. Judging eyes pinned Zadie like a rusted nail to a post. "They say she was never married," someone muttered loud enough to carrying a baby like that, no ring, no kin. Zadie did not speak. She kept walking, chin lifted, even though her legs trembled beneath her. Her destination was the old boarding house Miss Addie's place, because she had heard, back in Fort Benton, that if you had coin and no questions, Miss Addie would give you a bed. But as she climbed the porch, the door opened and Miss Addie stepped out with her arms folded tight across her wide chest. "I cannot take you," she said. "Not with him." Her eyes flicked to Jonah. "I will pay," Zadie said, voice hoarse. "I have money. I do not run a charity." "You should not be here. Folks talk." Zadie turned away before she cried. She would not let them see her fall apart. She stepped off the porch, her hands shaking as she adjusted Jonah against her. She had nowhere else to go. That was when the voice came deep, calm, and cutting through the wind like a warm fire. "She can stay with me." Zadie turned quickly, startled. A tall man stood beside a chestnut horse, reins loose in one hand. He was dressed in worn trail clothes, broad-shouldered, his coat dusted with travel. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but when he stepped forward, she saw his eyes blue as the high country lakes, steady and clear. Yates Prescott. She did not know him personally, but she had heard the name. He lived a few miles out, ran cattle in the northern stretch near Elk Creek. Kept to himself. Folks said he had come back from the war quiet and strange, but no one ever said he was unkind. Miss Addie sniffed. "That is your business, Yates, but do not bring trouble to mine." Yates ignored her. He looked at Zadie, not with pity, but with something else, something like understanding. "You need a place." Zadie looked down to Jonah, who was now asleep against her chest. Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket tighter. "I do not want charity," she said. "Then do not take it as such," he replied. "I have a spare room. Cabin is quiet. No one will bother you there." She hesitated. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Because you and the boy deserve better than this." She blinked hard, trying to keep her tears in check. Her legs finally gave out a little, and he caught her elbow to keep her from falling. "Come on," he said gently. "Let us get you warm." The ride to the cabin was quiet. Zadie sat behind him on the saddle, holding Jonah tight, unsure how to press close without seeming forward. But Yates did not seem to mind. He rode steady, one hand on the reins, the other resting lightly over hers where she clutched his coat. The cabin was tucked between two hills, with a wide front porch and smoke curling from a stone chimney. It was simple but clean, safe. He helped her down gently, careful not to jostle the baby. Inside, the fire was still crackling in the hearth. He lit a lantern, then brought out a wool blanket and laid it out on the couch. "You can take the bed," he said. "I will sleep out here." She looked around, unsure what to say. "You live alone," he nodded. "Always have." She crossed the room slowly, lowering herself onto the edge of the bed. Jonah stirred and gave a soft cry. She hushed him, rocking gently. Yates turned away, giving her space but not leaving. After a while, she asked, "Do you want to know how I ended up here?" He shook his head. "Not unless you want to tell me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Jonah's father left before he was born, said he would come back. He never did." Yates did not flinch. He just nodded once, then knelt to stir the fire. That night, after Zadie had put Jonah to sleep in a small basket Yates found for her, she sat by the fire with a cup of warm tea in her hands. Yates sat opposite, his long legs stretched out, his hat resting on the floor. "You do not think I am a sinner?" she asked softly. He looked up. "No, everyone else does. They are wrong." She stared into the fire. "You do not even know me." "I know enough." She looked over and their eyes met. For the first time in a long time, she felt something shift deep inside her, a stirring of calm, of hope. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "You are safe here, you and the boy." Zadie looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I do not know how I will repay you. You do not have to, but she would." Somehow, she would, and something about the way he looked at her, then quiet, steady, kind, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she had finally stepped into the place she was meant to be. The next morning came slow and gray, with a fine mist hanging low over the hills. Zadie stood at the window, one hand holding aside the curtain, the other pressed lightly to Jonah's back as he dozed in her arms. The cabin smelled faintly of ash and pine, the hearth's coals still warm from the night before. Outside, the land rolled gentle and wide, patches of frost clinging to the grass where the sun hadn't yet touched. Behind her, Yates moved quietly. She heard the scrape of a chair, the creak of leather boots, no words, just the steady rhythm of a man used to silence. "You have cattle," she said without turning. "A few dozen head," he answered. "They graze west of the creek." "I check on them every other day," she nodded, though he couldn't see it. "You do it alone," I managed. She turned then. "You ever think about hiring someone?" He looked up, resting his forearms on the table. "Thought about it, but folks talk too much." "I like the quiet." Zadie crossed to the stove. "I can cook," she said. "Clean too. If I'm to stay, I'd rather not be idle. You're not expected to work. I'm not asking permission, I'm offering." He studied her a moment before nodding once. "There's flour and lard in the cupboard." "Coffee too." The skillet was hanging near the stove, and she reached for it, careful not to wake Jonah. She eased him into the cradle Yates had whittled out of an old feed bin, padded with folded linens. He stirred but didn't cry. As the biscuits browned and the scent of salt pork filled the room, Yates watched her out of the corner of his eye. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" he asked. "My aunt kept a lodging house near Helena. She said if I wanted to eat, I'd better learn to feed others first." He smiled faintly at that. "She sounds like a hard woman." She had reason to be. They ate in comfortable quiet, the only sounds the soft clink of forks and the occasional wind pressing against the windows. After breakfast, Yates pulled on his coat. "I'll be back before dusk. There's a coyote been worrying the calves. I'll check the traps." Zadie moved to the door. "Be careful." He paused, then tipped his hat slightly, eyes meeting hers. "You too." When he was gone, she stood on the porch for a long while, Jonah bundled against her shoulder, both of them watching the trail until he disappeared into the trees. She didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until she let it out. That afternoon, she cleaned. Not because the cabin needed it, the place was kept neat, but because her hands needed something to do. She dusted the shelves, folded the spare linens, scrubbed the wooden floor until it shone. She found a tin of dried lavender tucked beside the hearth and placed a pinch in the cradle's corner. Jonah woke mid-afternoon, fussing until she rocked him in her arms, humming an old hymn. When he quieted, she sat by the fire and stitched the tear in her shawl, her needle glinting in the light. The hush of the place settled over her like a blanket, not heavy, but sure. By the time Yates returned, dusk had softened the sky to gold and dove gray. His coat was damp at the shoulders, and he carried 2 pelts tied with twine. "Got him," he said simply, hanging the bundle near the door. "You need a place to dry those properly," Zadie said. "I'll build a rack tomorrow," she nodded, brushing her hands clean on her apron. "I boiled the stew bones down. There's broth on the stove." He washed up at the basin, then sat at the table, his movements slow but deliberate. As he ate, he glanced at Jonah, now asleep again in the cradle. "He sleep like that every day." "Most days. You're lucky." She turned from the stove. "I don't feel lucky." He looked at her then, not just glanced, looked. "You're strong." She met his eyes, something unfamiliar stirring beneath her ribs. "I don't always feel that either." "Doesn't mean it's not true." Zadie sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "Why do you live this far out?" Came back from Virginia with too much noise in my head. "It's quieter here." She didn't ask what he'd seen. She could tell he wouldn't offer it easily. "I used to think I'd live in a town," she said. "Raise Jonah with neighbors, a porch and laundry lines. You still could." She shook her head just once. "Not after the way they looked at me." He didn't speak for a long time. "Then they don't see you." "Not really. And you do." He didn't blink. "I'm trying to." That night, after the dishes were washed and Jonah was down, Zadie lingered by the fire. Yates sat nearby, sharpening a small knife with long, even strokes. She watched the motion for a while. Then, very quietly, "Do you believe people can start over?" He didn't look up. "I believe it's the only way forward." She leaned back in the chair, tucked her feet beneath her, and closed her eyes for a moment. Outside, the wind had settled. The sky was clear, and stars began to prick through the darkness like lanterns hung in a faraway field. When she opened her eyes, Yates was still there, still watching, still quiet, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. By early May, the snow had given up its grip on the high hills, and the earth softened enough to show green. The creek behind the cabin ran faster, swollen with meltwater, and the cottonwoods along its banks rattled with fresh leaves. Zadie stood barefoot on the back stoop, skirts gathered in one hand, watching Jonah swat at the grass with a stick. His cheeks were pink from the sun, his curls damp with sweat, and he laughed each time the stick bent under its own weight. Yates had left at dawn to mend a broken fence post near the northern boundary. She watched for his return now out of habit more than worry. He always came back. She stepped down into the yard and crouched beside Jonah, her palm brushing his hair back. "You're getting heavy," she whispered. "And stubborn like your father." She winced at the words, not because they weren't true, but because she hadn't meant to say them aloud. She glanced toward the woods. No one heard. Inside, she washed the linens by hand in a basin, then strung them along the porch railing to dry. She found herself humming while she worked an old tune from years before, one her mother used to sing when the weather turned soft. The sound startled her. That evening, Yates returned later than usual, the sun already dipping low. His shirt was streaked with dirt and the sleeve torn near the cuff. He led his horse to the trough, poured a measure of oats into the bucket, then rolled his shoulder with a quiet wince. Zadie stepped outside, drying her hands on the hem of her apron. "You hurt." Fence post splintered when I drove it down. "Took a piece of me with it." "Let me see." He hesitated, then unbuttoned the cuff and held out his arm. A red gash striped the skin from wrist to elbow, not deep but raw. She guided him to the porch bench, fetched a clean cloth and a tin of salve from the shelf inside. "You need to keep this clean," she said, dabbing gently, "and covered." He didn't flinch, didn't look away. "You always this sure-handed." "I stitched up a horse once. He didn't thank me." Yates gave a low chuckle. "I would." She paused, cloth suspended over the wound. "You just did." When she finished wrapping his arm, she sat beside him on the bench, hands folded in her lap. "I found a letter," he said after a quiet stretch, "at the line shack, addressed to a man that used to run sheep up that way, postmarked 2 years back, never opened." She looked over. "What'll you do with it?" "Nothing. Man's long gone. Folks pass through, leave pieces behind." Zadie nodded slowly. "I left behind more than I meant to. You planning to go back for it?" "No," she said. "I think what I want now is up ahead, not behind." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet soil and pine. Jonah called from inside, a soft babble. Yates stood. "I'll finish brushing the horse." She caught his sleeve before he turned. "Why did you never marry?" He met her gaze, his face unreadable. "Didn't know what I had to give would be enough." Zadie held his eyes. "It is." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. That night, after Jonah was asleep and the fire burned low, Zadie opened the back door and stepped into the dark. The stars were scattered thick above her, the sky endless and still. She heard footsteps behind her, then the soft click of the door closing. Yates stood beside her, his shoulder near enough she could feel the heat of him. They didn't speak for a long while. Finally, she said, "You ever think about what it'd be like to share all this?" He didn't answer at first. Then, "Not until now." She nodded, her chest tight. He turned toward her, his voice low. "If you stayed, not just for the boy, not just for a place to rest, I'd make a life with you." Zadie, her breath caught. "I don't come with guarantees," she said. "Just a child and a name some folks won't forget. I'm not asking for guarantees." She looked up at him then, eyes shining with something fierce and quiet. "Then yes." He reached for her hand, rough fingers lacing with hers. And in the hush of that Montana night, stars wheeling above them, two people long marked by silence and loss stood side by side, no longer strangers, no longer alone. By late June, the garden rows behind the cabin had taken hold, beans curling up twine stakes, squash leaves broad as a saddle flap, and the first tomatoes blushing green and firm. Zadie knelt in the dirt, hands sunk to her wrists in the cool soil. Jonah sat in the shade beneath the lean-to, chewing on a strip of dried apple, his legs kicking the dust with idle rhythm. She straightened slowly, pressing her hand to the small of her back, and looked toward the barn. Yates had been inside most of the morning, working on a new yoke for the team. She could hear the rasp of his plane through the open doors, steady and measured. She wiped her hands on her apron and called out, "You got room for 2 more hands." The sound of the plane paused. A moment later, Yates stepped into the light, sleeves rolled high, sawdust clinging to his forearms. "You planning on joining the cattle drive or just supervising?" "I can carve pegs and patch harness same as any man. Better, maybe." He leaned against the doorframe, studying her. "You ever done it before?" "No," she said, brushing a curl from her face, "but I've watched it done." "That counts for something?" He chuckled low in his chest. "Come on then, let's see what you've got." Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of pine and oil. A row of tools hung along one wall, each placed with care. She picked up a drawknife and ran her thumb along the edge. "Sharp enough to split a hair," she said. "I keep them that way." They worked side by side, the only sound the scrape of wood and the occasional murmur from Jonah outside. Yates handed her a length of rawhide, and she began wrapping the yoke's crossbar, fingers sure despite the unfamiliar task. "You ever think about building something bigger?" she asked after a while. He glanced over. "Like what?" "Something with more than 2 rooms, a porch that wraps all the way around, a place a boy could grow up in." His hands stilled on the brace. "You thinking of staying that long?" "I already have." He didn't speak for a moment. Then, quietly, "I've got plans sketched in the drawer by the stove. Never showed anyone. You should." He turned to her, eyes steady. "You'd help me raise him." "Jonah," she met his gaze without hesitating. "He already looks for you when you're not near." Yates let out a slow breath and nodded once. "Then we'll build it together." That evening, the wind shifted warm from the south, carrying the scent of sage and dust. They sat beneath the cottonwood near the creek, Jonah asleep across Zadie's lap, a blanket tucked around his knees. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and the frogs had begun their chorus from the shallows. "You ever miss the city?" Yates asked, leaning back on his elbows, his hat tipped low. "I miss the sound of voices at night, doors closing, folks calling to each other. But I don't miss the way I stopped being a person once they saw I was pregnant." He was quiet for a moment then. "They ever try to take him from you?" "A woman in Helena told me I'd be better off letting a family take him, said I was too young, too poor. That he'd never know his father anyway." Yates sat up, his jaw set. "She was wrong. I know that now." She reached for his hand, her fingers tracing the calluses on his palm. "You make this place feel like home, Yates, even when I'm quiet. Even when I don't know what comes next." He turned his hand to close around hers. "I don't need much, just you and him and the land under us." They sat like that until the stars brightened over the ridgeline, no promises spoken, none needed. Later, when she laid Jonah down and turned to find Yates still standing at the doorway, she stepped closer, the hush between them as soft as the night air. "I want to marry you," she said, voice low but certain. "Not for shelter, not for the boy, for you." He didn't hesitate. "Then we'll do it." "Right, and with your name spoken proud." She nodded once, eyes shining. "I want to take your name. I want Jonah to have it too." He reached to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing just beneath her eye. "Then we'll start tomorrow with the preacher, and a dress, and a place cleared for planting the first post of our new home." And in that moment, there was nothing left of shame, only the quiet truth of 2 people who had chosen each other, fully and freely, under the wide Montana sky. The wedding was held on the first Sunday of July beneath a stand of aspens that edged Yates' western pasture. Zadie wore a borrowed dress bleached soft by time, its hem stitched up to fit her frame. She'd let her hair down for the first time since arriving in Dawson Hollow, and the wind caught the loose ends as though the trees themselves were reaching to bless her. Preacher Bell rode up from Elk Creek with a Bible wrapped in oilcloth and a face weathered by sun and sermons. He said the vows steady and without flourish, his voice just loud enough for the few who stood close. Miss Addie, who had come after all, dressed in Sunday black, old Mr. Hatch from the mill, leaning on a cane carved from a river birch, and a handful of neighbors Yates had known since boyhood, all standing quiet with hats in hand. Jonah fussed once during the vows, but Zadie held him against her heart and he calmed. Yates didn't look away, not even then. When the preacher nodded and stepped back, Yates took her hand and pressed his forehead to hers. "You're my home now," he said so only she could hear. She kissed him, her voice caught somewhere between joy and disbelief. And when she whispered his name just once, it sounded like something she'd waited her whole life to say. They shared a meal afterward, rough-hewn tables set up in the shade, dishes passed hand to hand. Zadie tasted blackberry pie for the first time in 2 years. Jonah was passed from arm to arm, cooed over and rocked, his cheeks sticky with honey, and his curls mussed by so many kind hands. That night, after the guests had gone and the lanterns had burned low, Yates led her back inside the cabin, only it wasn't quite the same. The old cot in the corner had been taken down, the cradle moved beside the bed they now shared. A woven rug from the trading post stretched across the floor. On the wall above the hearth, he had hung a small frame carved from juniper. Inside was a pressed cornflower, its blue faded but still bright. Zadie touched the frame lightly. "Where'd you find it?" "Grew up by the creek. There's more near the bend." She turned to him, eyes full. "You did all this today?" He drew her close, resting his chin against her temple. "I wanted it ready. You deserved to come home to something whole." They lay down together for the first time, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as husband and wife. There was no urgency, no hesitation, only the slow, steady unfolding of trust that had been growing between them since that first day when she'd stepped through the town with mud on her boots and a baby in her arms. She traced the scar that ran along his left shoulder, when she hadn't noticed before. "Was it from the war?" He nodded. "Shrapnel, took weeks to heal right. You still feel it, only when it rains or when you touch it like that." She smiled, her fingers stilling. "Then I'll be careful." "No," he said, turning to kiss her palm. "Don't be." They woke with the windows open to the sound of birds nesting in the eaves. Zadie rose first, pulling on her shawl, and padded barefoot to check on Jonah. He was curled on his side, thumb in his mouth, a patch of sunlight warming his blanket. Down at the creek, Yates began marking the ground for the new house. He set stakes in the dirt, counting off paces, pausing to squint at the ridge lines. Zadie joined him with a slice of bread in hand and her hair braided back. "You want the porch to face west?" she asked, shielding her eyes. "Evenings are quietest then. Good light for reading. You read." "Not much, but I could. I'll teach you," she said. "If you teach me how to ride without slipping sideways off the saddle." He looked at her sideways, lips twitching. "Deal." They cleared the ground together, Yates swinging the axe, Zadie piling brush. Jonah napped in the shade of a canvas sheet strung between 2 trees, his soft snores barely louder than the bees humming nearby. The work was slow but steady. Each board nailed down was a promise kept. By the end of August, the frame stood tall, the roof slanted to catch rain, and the windows placed to let in the morning light. Zadie painted the shutters herself, a deep green she'd bartered for in town, while Yates hung the door with hinges he'd forged from scrap iron. Inside, the rooms were still bare, but she could see them already. A kitchen warmed by bread, a table worn smooth by elbows and laughter, a bed that never had to be empty again. On the last day of the build, Zadie stood in the doorway of their new home, arms crossed as she watched Yates drive in the final nail of the porch rail. He stepped back, dusted off his hands, and looked at her with something quiet in his gaze. "You built this," she said. "We built it." He stepped onto the porch and offered his hand. She took it, and together they stood at the edge, watching the sun slip behind the hills, the sky streaked with fire and gold. That night they moved their few belongings into the house. Zadie laid Jonah in his new bed near the hearth, then lit a single lamp and set it on the windowsill. Yates wrapped his arms around her from behind. "I want this forever," she leaned into him. "You already have it." And so they stayed through the long winters and the dry summers, through the birth of a daughter with her father's eyes and her mother's quiet will, through harvests that sometimes barely fed them and years when their table was full. They never left Dawson Hollow. They never needed to. The land gave them just enough, and each other gave them everything else. And in the quiet warmth of their home, love lingered not in grand declarations, but in the steady rhythm of a life built hand in hand, earned, weathered, and deeply, truly shared.